You know the outfit. The long waxed coat down to the ankles, the wide black hat, the gloves, the boots, the stick held out at arm's length, and the mask. The leather face with glass eyepieces and that long curved beak like something that used to be a bird and has been doing this job too long. It is one of the most recognizable images in European history. It appears on album covers and in video games and on the shoulders of about 400,000 people every October. And when you picture it, you almost certainly picture it in a medieval street in the middle of the Black Death, stepping over bodies in the 14th century. Here is the problem with that picture. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347. The beaked mask was invented, as far as anyone can establish, in 1619 by a French physician named Charles de Lorme during an outbreak in Paris. That is a gap of roughly 270 years. Nobody who died in the Black Death ever saw one. The costume you associate with the worst pandemic in European history postdates it by longer than the United States has existed. And the mask is only the first thing that is wrong. The job itself is almost nothing like people imagine. These men were mostly not there to cure anyone, they were frequently not the best doctors available, and a significant part of the work was clerical. So let us go through what a plague doctor actually was, what was in the beak and why, and what they spent their days doing. Charles de Lorme was not a backstreet physician. He was chief physician to Louis XIII and had served the Medici family, which puts him at the top of the European medical profession. In 1619, with plague moving through France, he designed a full protective outfit. And it is worth appreciating that this is, functionally, an early attempt at a hazmat suit. A long coat of waxed or oiled leather from the neck to the ankles, deliberately treated so that nothing would soak into it. Leather gloves, leather boots, a hat, glass covering the eyes, and the mask. De Lorme described it himself. A nose half a foot long, shaped like a beak, filled with perfume, with only 2 holes, one on each side near the nostrils. The design spread, and it stayed in use for well over a century. Which is why the image survives so strongly. It was not a one-off. Generations of European city dwellers saw men dressed like this walking their streets. It is worth understanding why a suit had to be invented at all, because it tells you what these outbreaks were actually like. Plague did not arrive once and leave. The Black Death of the 14th century was the opening catastrophe, but the disease then settled into Europe and came back, again and again, in waves, for the next 400 years. A city might be struck every 10 or 20 years. Some generations saw it 3 times. So by de Lorme's day, plague was not an unimaginable horror out of the distant past. It was a recurring civic emergency that every European city had procedures for, the way a coastal town has procedures for a storm. There were quarantine laws. There were pest houses outside the walls. There were officials whose entire job existed because of it. A protective uniform is what you get when a disaster stops being a shock and starts being a job. But now the important question, and the one everybody gets wrong. What was the beak for? Not filtration. Nobody in 1619 had any concept of a germ. The dominant theory of disease at the time was miasma, the belief that illness traveled through corrupted air, bad air. You could smell it, in fact, and the smell was not a symptom of the problem. The smell was understood to be the problem. Plague came from foul vapors rising out of swamps, rotting matter, corpses, filth. If you breathed the bad air, you got the disease, which produces a completely logical response, given the premise. If corrupted air causes plague, then purifying the air before it reaches you should prevent it. So the beak was a chamber, and it was packed with aromatics, dried flowers, herbs, mint, camphor, rose petals, myrrh, cloves, sometimes a vinegar-soaked sponge. Some recipes included stranger things. Powdered viper flesh turns up in accounts, which tells you these were pharmacological formulas rather than potpourri. The air came in through 2 small holes, passed through all of that, and arrived at the physician's nose smelling of herbs instead of the street. To him, that was the treatment working. He could smell that it was working. Now, did it do anything against the actual disease? No. Bubonic plague is caused by a bacterium, and it mostly reached people through the bite of an infected flea, which does not care what your nose smells like. But there is an accidental footnote worth having. The full outfit was a sealed leather barrier from head to foot. Waxed leather, gloves, boots, a hat, the face covered. Fleas cannot easily bite through that. So the suit may well have offered some real protection, not because of the herbs and not for the reason anyone believed, but because the man had inadvertently sealed himself away from the insects that were actually spreading it. The theory was wrong. The equipment was, in a limited and completely unintentional way, not useless. And it is worth resisting the urge to feel superior about miasma, because it was not stupid. It was a theory built on the available evidence, and the evidence genuinely pointed that way. Disease clustered in filthy, crowded, low-lying places that smelled appalling. It spared clean, airy districts more often. Remove the stench, drain the marsh, clear the refuse, and outbreaks did sometimes decline. That correlation is real. Miasma theory got the mechanism completely wrong while getting the observation broadly right, which is one of the most common ways for smart people to be wrong for a very long time. Filth genuinely was the problem. It just was not the smell. Acting on that mistaken theory also produced some of the first serious public sanitation efforts in European history. Wrong reasoning, useful behavior, which happens more often in the history of medicine than anybody likes to admit. Here is the part that reframes the whole image. A plague doctor was, in most cases, a municipal employee. Cities hired them, under contract, at agreed pay, and the reason they had to is grim. When plague arrived, the physicians who could afford to leave left. The wealthy fled to the countryside, and their doctors went with them because a physician with a rich clientele has both the means and the motive to be somewhere else. That left the city without medical staff at the exact moment it needed them, so the council would hire whoever remained or whoever could be attracted in, which meant that plague doctors were frequently not the leading physicians of the day. They were young men without established practices, second-tier practitioners, sometimes people with barely any medical training at all, taking a dangerous public post at danger pay rates because it was the job available. And what the city wanted from them was not primarily cures. Nobody could cure plague. Everyone involved knew nobody could cure plague. What the city wanted was administration of the catastrophe. They counted the dead, walking the streets and recording numbers, which is where a great deal of our surviving data on these outbreaks comes from. They diagnosed, which mattered enormously, because a diagnosis determined whether a house was sealed and a family confined. They performed autopsies, in a period when dissection was otherwise heavily restricted, because a plague year suspended a lot of ordinary rules. And they witnessed wills. Sit with that one. A dying man in a sealed house needs his final instructions recorded by someone with standing, and there is nobody else who will come in the door. So the man in the beaked mask sits down beside a plague bed and takes dictation about who gets the house. The contracts survive in some places, and they are bleak reading. A city hires a plague doctor for a fixed term at a fixed rate, and the terms often include conditions that tell you exactly what everyone expected. The doctor may be required to live apart from the healthy population. He may be forbidden from treating ordinary patients because he is considered contaminated. In some arrangements, the city agrees to pay for his funeral or to support his family, which is not a clause you include unless both parties have done the arithmetic. Some cities paid extremely well. They had to. You are asking a man to walk into sealed houses full of dying people during an event that has already killed the last person who held the post. And there was a second-order problem that comes up repeatedly in the records. Some of the men who took these jobs were not physicians in any meaningful sense at all, and a plague year is an excellent time to be a fraud. A city desperate for medical staff, a population desperate for anything, and a costume that covers you from head to foot and hides your face. That is the job. Not a healer moving through the streets with a cure. A public official in protective equipment, counting bodies, sealing doors, cutting open the dead, and writing down last wishes. Which brings us to the object in his hand, and it is the detail that gives the whole thing away. The plague doctor carries a long wooden cane. In the illustrations, he is usually holding it out in front of him, and people tend to assume it is a walking stick or something ceremonial. It is a tool for not touching people. He used it to examine patients at a distance, to lift a sheet, to move a limb, to point at a swelling in the groin or the armpit without putting his hands anywhere near it. He used it to direct people where to go. And there are accounts of it being used to keep the desperate away from him, because a man who is believed to be the only medical help in a sealed city gets grabbed at. Every element of that outfit is about separation. The waxed coat so nothing soaks in, the gloves, the glass over the eyes, the beak holding a wall of herbs between his lungs and the street, and a stick so that even his examination happens at arm's length. This is not the uniform of a man who believes he can save you. It is the uniform of a man who has been sent in to document what happens to you and would very much like to survive it. And when they did treat, it was bad. It is worth being honest about how bad. The standard interventions of the period were bloodletting, opening a vein to drain blood from a patient whose body was already fighting a catastrophic infection, and lancing the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that give bubonic plague its name. Some applied poultices, some used dried toad, or various compounds that did nothing at all. Bloodletting a plague patient is not neutral. You are taking blood and strength out of someone in septic crisis. The most likely effect of the leading treatment was to make death arrive sooner. There is no way to make this look good in hindsight, and the point is not to sneer at them. These men were operating with a completely wrong model of disease in the middle of a mass casualty event, with no way of testing anything. They believed the air was poison and behaved accordingly, and they died in large numbers doing it, walking into sealed houses that everybody else was running away from. Wrong about everything, and still the ones who went in. There is one more thing they did that we should not skip, because it is the part that actually saved lives, and nobody at the time understood why it worked. Quarantine. The word itself comes from the Venetian practice of holding arriving ships for 40 days, 40 giorni, before letting anyone ashore. Cities sealed infected households, restricted movement between districts, isolated the sick outside the walls, and controlled the roads. All of that was justified by miasma: keep the bad air contained, keep the corrupted people away from the clean ones. And all of it worked, to a degree, for reasons nobody would understand for another 200 years. Because separating people also separates their fleas and their rats and their contact. The plague doctor's diagnoses were what triggered a lot of that machinery. He was the man who decided that this house was infected, and once he said it, the door was sealed with the family inside, which means his most consequential act was not medical at all. It was the moment he wrote something down. So why does the mask live in the 14th century in everyone's head? Partly, it is just that both things are plague, and the Black Death is the plague everyone can name. 270 years compresses to nothing when the label is the same. But the bigger reason is that the costume became an image before it became a memory. In 17th and 18th century Europe, the beaked doctor turns up as a print, a satire, a figure of fear and mockery, and then, crucially, it enters Venetian carnival as a mask. The Medico della Peste is a stock carnival character, which means the outfit survived not as a historical record, but as a costume, detached from any date, worn for fun for centuries. An image that circulates as a costume does not carry a timestamp with it. So when the modern world reached for something to represent plague, it took the most striking plague-related visual available and quietly attached it to the most famous plague. And the 270-year gap disappeared without anyone deciding it should. Which leaves the real thing, which I think is stranger and better than the myth, not a medieval figure of doom. A 17th century public health official, in the first purpose-built protective suit in European history, designed by the king's own physician, walking into houses that everyone else had abandoned, with a mask full of flowers that did nothing, a coat that may have accidentally saved his life, and a stick to keep the dying at arm's length while he wrote down who should get the house. There is a village in England that took the opposite approach. When the plague arrived there, they did not run, and they did not seal the sick in. They sealed themselves in, on purpose, with it. That story is on your screen right now.